Welcome to the Bluestocking Circle podcast, Lady Nerds on Popular Culture. We're your hosts, Kat,
B,
and Grisel.
This is episode 37, Misery. In this episode, we'll be discussing both the book and the movie, so if you haven't read or seen it, just be warned, we will be spoiling all there is to spoil. Stephen King is a household name who needs little introduction. He is known for his outlandishly gruesome horror bestsellers, the extremely popular movies made from his stories, and for his prolific publishing output. In fact, in the late 70s, after the success of his first three novels, Carrie, Salem's Lot, and The Shining, he began to publish books under the pseudonym Richard Bachman, in part because publishing guidelines said that an author could only release one book a year so as not to saturate the market. Misery, published in 1987, was intended to be a Richard Bachman title. However, in 1985, while in the midst of writing this story of a most dedicated fan, one of Stephen King's own constant readers, a book clerk from DC, noticed the similarities between Bachman and King. After the cat was out of the bag, Bachman was killed off, and Misery was released as a proper Stephen King novel. The novel depicts the writer of a popular adventure romance series, Paul Sheldon, who gets taken in by #1 fan Annie Wilkes. She subjects him to various criticisms about his writing and tortures him by forcing him to write a new book that fits with her idea of how the series should go. Although it is an over-the-top representation of the devoted fan and the lengths they will go to, in a strange way, it seems fitting to these modern times where fans are able to voice their opinions straight to the creators via Twitter and other internet forums. Over the past few years, there have been several examples of toxic fan culture asserting their views and professing hatred when a movie or TV series takes a turn they do not like. I think Annie Wilkes would fit right in these new days of devoted fandom. As for the movie, which was released Christmas of 1990, I think this is one of the best adaptations of a Stephen King book, and I am not alone in this. It is always in the top of the best Stephen King movie list and remains one of the only movies based on his works that earned an Oscar, Kathy Bates for Best Actress. And after going down a Wikipedia rabbit hole of the 63rd Academy Awards, I will also say that I think it should have been nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay as well. What draws me to Stephen King is the way he exposes the horror of the ordinary. Yes, many of his books feature the supernatural, but the visions that stick with me are the vivid and realistic portrayals of bullying, domestic abuse, obsession, greed, and the unfortunately relevant worldwide pandemic. He said in an interview that the first movie he ever saw was a horror movie that terrified yet exhilarated him, Bambi. Most people would probably label Bambi as a classic children's film, but King isn't wrong. The horror is there, and he has continued to terrify and exhilarate his fans for nearly 50 years. And now B will give us her newbie synopsis.
#1 fan Annie Wilkes saves novelist Paul Sheldon from a car accident of his own making. She feeds him, she cleans him, she dresses him, she gives him free lodging with an inspirational view, she nurses him back to health, and she encourages him to write the best novel in his historical romance series Misery. And what thanks does she get? He goes and kills her.
Well, that's one way to look at the plot of Misery, and let's go into our origin stories to hear a little more. As I mentioned in the minisode, grades 7 through 12 were my big Stephen King years. He was my first adult author I read, and I consumed so many Stephen King books back to back during those years that I don't actually remember the first time I read Misery. However, I do have distinct memories of going into the main section of my local library to find his books, and it felt very exciting to have moved on from the kids area. My mom is also a fan of his, so I remember how fun it was to share that with her, and she would often recommend which book of his I should read next. Also, just a small aside, one of the reasons I have read Anne of Green Gables so many times is tied to Stephen King. I would stay up late reading King and then be too scared to go to sleep, so I would have to read something more comforting that lacked suspense. So I would turn to Anne again and again. And now seeing Richard Farnsworth, aka Matthew from the 80s Anne series, in the movie Misery, that's two ties. Grisel, what about you?
I was very pleased when I saw that Richard Farnsworth was in the movie. He made it that much better. Well, my misery origin story is not so much a misery origin as a Stephen King origin, kind of like yours, Kat. I had a friend in high school whose mom was obsessed with Stephen King. She had been following him since he debuted, and she had every single copy. So my friend was naturally like a born Stephen King fan for friend reasons and high school reasons. I tried to get into Stephen King as well. I read Carrie and then The Shining, and I tried my hand at Salem's Lot, which is ginormous. Do not recommend. And a few others here and there that I kind of like dropped in and out of. But other than Carrie and The Shining, I couldn't get through any of the rest. The truth is, I find Stephen King dreadfully boring. I also realized that I get zero pleasure out of horror, and luckily I realized this early on. I don't care for it in any form of media. I don't get that thrill that horror lovers get from that visceral, like, survival high. So I never got to read Misery, but I did see bits and pieces of the film, because you kind of can't avoid it. It's kind of pop culture history. And I basically got the plot from Stephen King's overall penetration of pop culture.
Yeah, this is definitely one that shows up in a lot of references. B, what about you?
I do have a very specific misery origin story, and it goes back to, like so many other things in my life, the X Files. As we all know by now, I did not take the 2016 X Files revival well at all, and it was obvious from the spoilers that started leaking during the summer of 2015 that the revival would be utter garbage, as it eventually was. And so I was infuriated by the revival's very existence early on. And one coworker who had the misfortune of knowing me at such a turbulent time in my life said that she expected me to go misery on the X Files creator one day. I did not know what that meant, so she laughed and told me to look it up, and that's my misery origin story. However, I had read a few Stephen King books beforehand, and I have read one since, not including Misery right now.
All right, now I see why you gave that description that was very positive towards Annie Wilkes in your newbie synopsis.
I have a feeling this podcast is going to be used against me in a trial someday.
Before we get into our normal segments, I thought we would just give some brief book versus movie discussion. To me, Kathy Bates is perfect. James Caan is perfect. They both have very good, expressive faces, and they manage to bring a lot of humor to such a dark story. I think that the screenplay is also really excellent and keeps all the things that you want from the book and really kind of streamlines everything else. And I applaud the screenwriter for doing so well.
And that screenwriter would be William Goldman, who also wrote The Princess Bride, which we covered earlier this year. And Rob Reiner directed this movie. He also directed The Princess Bride, so they teamed up again to make this after The Princess Bride, which was shocking to me.
I do think that's funny. And I think it's interesting because The Princess Bride and this are both sort of about storytelling and writing and the audience that it's intended for. So there is a lot of similarities in themes, I would say.
And also in the framing of certain shots. For example, Annie and Paul are framed when she's reading to him and he's in the bed, the same way that the grandfather and the boy are framed in the beginning of The Princess Bride. And moreover, when Paul slips the Novril powder into Annie's wine glass, that shot is directed the exact same way that Wesley is depicted slipping the iocane powder into Vizzini's wine glass. It's the same angles of the camera, it's the same framing. It has to be an intentional callback.
I don't know. I don't know that the same people who were into The Princess Bride were necessarily flocking to see Misery, but it could be something that he did on purpose.
I also noticed that in that scene, and I think it's definitely intentional because that scene is not in the book. So it's certainly something that the screenwriter added in. So he must really love wine poisoning scenes. Which of the two do you prefer if you had to choose the book or the movie?
I like the movie more than the book. And the reason I like the movie more than the book is that the investigation subplot was added and moved to the forefront of the movie compared to the book. And I like seeing how people were looking for Paul sort of behind the scenes. Also, we got the great Laura McCall as his agent, which was a very welcome bonus. I liked the sheriff having more of a personality than he does in the book, especially since he was played by Matthew Cuthbert. And basically, I thought the movie had a nicer, more well rounded story overall from an external perspective. Like you said, the book is very internal to Paul, so I like seeing those extraneous characters filling in what's going on around him while he's missing. However, I did like the ending of the book more than the ending of the movie because I like that Paul's comeback novel was Misery's Return in the book, and in the movie it was changed to be something completely different. I think it's more fair, if you will, that his return to publishing was inspired by Annie, as it is in the book, in contrast to the movie.
I weirdly found that I kind of enjoyed the movie. I listened to the audiobook. I did not actually physically read the book myself. The audiobook narrator was excellent with what she had to work with. But it's a much darker story in general, and her interpretation was super dark as well. It was also very slow. I
Wait,
had to
I'm
speed it up.
sorry. It was narrated by a female audiobook reader?
Yes.
Wow, interesting. Okay, I guess I just assumed since it's so internal to his story that it would be a male reader, but
No,
okay.
yeah, it's a female reader. She does voices really well, so she can lower her voice timbre and all that. I don't know the technical aspects of narrating, but she did a really great job. But yes, it is a female narrator for this book. It's actually a really good narration. I recommend it. So I did listen to the audiobook, which was a lot darker, and then after I had finished listening, I watched the movie, which had a completely different tone. Totally threw me for a loop because it comes across much more tame than the book does, both in the plot and in the actions that happen with between Annie and Paul. So I kind of found myself liking the movie. So if I had to pick one over the other, I would pick the movie as my preferred format. Also, gets rid of all the excess flab that Stephen King includes in the book, which is why I didn't really get into it until three-quarters of the way through, because there was a lot that I could have done without.
Yeah, I actually agree. I really like the movie a lot. I return to the movie frequently, whereas the book I maybe only read like 3 times. I find the movie is so
Only.
enjoyable. Only, yeah. I mean, including this time just now, so but the movie is definitely tamer than the book, and because it's so internal to Paul, it really depicts more of his drug addiction, and it's really no secret that in the 80s when he was writing this book, Stephen King was addicted to cocaine and alcohol, and he's frequently discussed this and his rehabilitation. He has flat out said that Annie Wilkes is a representation of cocaine and that her highs and lows, her overpraising and then sharp criticisms are all manifestations of basically what it felt like to be writing while doing cocaine. So the movie kind of undercuts all of that and actually has Paul stop taking the painkillers, whereas in the book he becomes so addicted to them that that sort of drives more of the story and why he has a harder time to get away maybe. But I definitely agree. I think that the movie is just like pretty perfect and the book has a lot of excess stuff that we'll get into in our different segments.
So much excess.
Yeah, Stephen King is definitely known for that. And I will
Yeah.
say a big part of that is probably the drug and alcohol use because a lot of his books in the 80s are so overdone and also have a lot of similar plots and storylines happening. So there's just like a really frantic speed of output of his writing. And I think a lot of things get muddled and it's frankly not always the best.
Where was his editor?
Making a lot of money on all these bestsellers.
Yeah, I don't think they were editing him much. This was coming out as he was writing it.
Yeah. Do we have any other thoughts on the book versus movie?
I found myself thinking of it as a cautionary tale of a manic pixie dream girl gone awry as I was watching the movie, because movie Annie is really cute in a weird way. I don't know if it's Kathy Bates. I don't know if it's the way they dress her or just, the moments when she's having her highs, she's really like perky and upbeat. She kind of is charming at times, and
She's very sweet.
she's very sweet. It's so weird. But I was like, I kind of like this psychopathic murderer a little bit too much until obviously, things go awry. Totally different from the book. I think that's also why I leaned into the movie a little bit more because I could feel sympathetic towards her as a character and embrace the fact that she does have mental health disorders, which have obviously never been dealt with, which is why she's a murderer. But I had no sympathy for any of the characters in the book. So I was able to not relate to the movie, but like engage with it better as a product. Let's call it.
Too late. You said relate. You're going on stand with me, Grisel.
No, I refuse.
Ah, I have it all. I have the evidence. What about you, B? Any other thoughts?
I do, but I think it's better served by Ship Wars.
All right. Well, then let's head into our ship wars. So I will say that when I first started working on my notes, I was concerned about this segment. Ship wars in misery. But I do think that the movie gives us more to work with, and so I will say that the only ship I can accept is the sheriff and his wife. They are so sweet and funny, and they are definitely a welcome addition to the story. Plus, the fact that the sheriff is played by Matthew from Anne of Green Gables helps, And his wife is actually played by a character from Sex and the City. I don't know if either of you guys watched, but she actually plays Kyle MacLachlan's mother in that show, and she's like a ritzy upper crust New Yorker named Bunny. So I was very happy to see her show up in this as well. And I'll say too, their whole dynamic really reminded me of the movie Fargo. I don't know, like sort of the small town sheriff going on this case and like just having a really sweet and loving relationship, even though he's dealing with these like weird, disturbing cases, is kind of similar to the relationship in the movie Fargo as well.
And it does turn it more into a mystery than the book, whereas the book is more straight up murder, torture porn. This has that aspect of we're sleuthing, trying to find this guy.
Do you love when the sheriff is talking on the phone to his book publisher and he's like, "Oh, I'm going to take the name down and put it into our system." He just writes it on a note and sticks it onto like a cork board. Like, yep, this is
That
our
was very
system.
cute.
I also, like I said, loved the sheriff and his wife. I thought they were adorable. And I really found it cute when they're in his car and she like puts her hand on his knee and tries to get frisky and he's like, "No, cop car is business time, not sexy time." But like he says it obviously in a different way, but that's kind of how it sounded to me. I thought it was adorable.
I just want a third. Buster and Virginia in the movie are couple goals. They're so cute.
They
Yeah, and
are.
I will say it's nice to see like an older couple who's just like sweet and in love and also sexual. It doesn't happen often in movies, I think.
That's true. I will say, if we want to deep dive and take my usual route of let's find the weird ship, I will say that Annie's love for her favorite series is a pure and deep love that leads to some pure and deep triggers. And Paul's agent in the film also has a really good relationship with him. I really liked that dynamic in the movie. You don't see that in the book. Though I will say that her office business situation is completely idealized in terms of publishing then, and definitely not even a thing in publishing now.
Yeah, Annie's love is pretty deep, I will say. So I can see that.
You can hear Kat's caution growing
Yeah, I'm
every
like,
time Crystal and I pray, Daddy.
We love Annie!
I just
Feel
Most
the
overwhelmed by
rage!
relatable character ever.
Down with the patriarchy!
The awkward pauses get longer every time.
She can't handle this.
I'm reevaluating all of your deep abiding fandoms now. Like, how much do they love these things? How far are they willing to go?
Oh no.
Well, I do think a big part of Annie's appeal is Kathy Bates, as we were saying. But I'll also say that the movie plays a lot more with a love triangle within the Misery books, and that's actually one of the details that Annie is waiting anxiously to find out. Who does Misery end up with, Ian or Jeffrey? So I thought that was a nice addition because that is such a thing in those types of books of playing out this long romantic love triangle. So I like that addition in it.
I was surprised they just randomly changed Jeffrey's name to Winthorne in the movie, but yes, I agree. There would definitely be a Team Ian, a Team Jeffrey, and a Team Ian/Jeffrey were Misery a real series, and it would be very intense.
Well, I'll just say that in terms of that love triangle, they're both basically the same to me, and I have no preference for either. But I am curious. I wonder who Annie was hoping she would end up with.
I will admit that I skipped most of those scenes, so I don't know which one was which. So I have no comment on that. But I do kind of want to bring it back. This could technically fall under any of our segments. It could be a catharsis or a feminist rant or anywhere. But the selection of Kathy Bates for Annie, obviously it made her career. But I find it interesting how she was cast because you get the impression based on the book that Annie is supposed to be, as far as Paul described her, physically huge and intimidating, and in his terms, masculine. And I kind of pictured the Trunchbull from Matilda as the sort of character that would be Annie, whereas I found Kathy Bates, like I said, really charming and cute. And like, is it because she's a non-traditional Hollywood actress that she's considered unattractive? I don't know, but I just found that a little interesting. Just a side comment.
I do know that they were writing the screenplay basically with Kathy Bates in mind, and she was sort of the first choice, whereas they had a lot of different actors lined up for the Paul role. And yes, he always describes her as like sort of masculine or very large, but I mean, Kathy Bates, like, not a tiny woman. So even though she's not like the massive person that I was imagining, I also think some of that is because he's always in bed. And so no matter what, she's sort of looming over him. B, do you have any other thoughts?
I do. I do not like how the movie gave Annie a more romantic interest in Paul than the book did. It's this need in every single work to sort of say that the only way a woman can be interested in a man is romantically. Whereas in the book, I thought it was clear that her interest in him was solely in terms of the writing, the novel, the stories. In the movie, she was pretty clearly in love with him as well, beyond the writing. So I didn't like that addition to the movie. I thought it was unnecessary.
The movie has such a different tone from the book in that sense, and it sometimes has the feel of a rom com, which is so wrong given what happens in the story.
You changed the movie score, and yeah, you could cut a rom-com trailer from this
Yep,
movie.
just put like an 80s track over it, little synth pop, and it's a little love story in the cabins.
Yeah, I agree. And I do find it an unnecessary addition. The whole scene where they're having dinner and she's sort of like dressed up and is all excited to sit down with him, I thought was totally unnecessary. I also like in the book that she's really only there, or she's really only interested in the product of his work. She doesn't even care to learn his process or like how his mind thinks of things. She's just like, I just want to read the story when you're done with it. We don't even have to like talk about it or have anything else to do. So I thought that was unnecessary too. I don't feel that there has to be this romantic element to it. It's weird.
Yeah, that one scene where they were having dinner, I seriously thought he was having a fever dream and that it was going to do a fade to black, and then suddenly it was real, and I was like, oh, where did that come from?
Also, William Goldman could work in his powder in a wine glass obsession.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think we're wrapping up our ship war. So why don't we head into our feminist rant? I will say right from the beginning, and this happens pretty early in the book, that there is an alarming use of the word rape when Paul is remembering how Annie gave him mouth to mouth. And it's really casual and it made me bristle and it just seems so unnecessary. I don't know why you would use that word to talk about another form of torture or aggression. I just don't like it at all. And I immediately it left a bad taste in my mouth.
Yes, I hated that. And he does it a lot. I haven't read any newer Stephen King's, so I don't know if this is something he has stopped doing. I hope he has. I feel like Stephen King's a pretty woke guy, so I'm going to be gentle and assume that he has learned his ways and doesn't do that anymore. But he does that a lot in his earlier novels. He'll describe some sort of attack in some way as a rape, and it's like, no, dude, not the same thing. And he also does this thing. I remember distinctly one particular line from The Shining that I read when I was like 14 or 15, where the caretaker and his wife have basically, I wouldn't call it making love because that's at the point where he's already being abusive and horrible to her, but at some point they have sex. And she is reminiscing and ruminating on the sperm that is leaking from her body. And I'm like, no, no, dude, that's definitely not. I don't think this is what she would be thinking about at this moment when her husband is kind of losing his mind. There's this idea where he puts these thoughts into women's brains, and it's such a male writer thing to do. There's a huge phenomenon on Twitter where people find these lines and stick them on tweets, and people laugh about them because, yeah, this is not what women are thinking. And Stephen King loves to do that. He loves to throw rape around as a concept, and he gives women these weird thoughts that just don't make sense because women don't think that way. That is my piece. That is my rant. That is my soapbox.
I'll say I do love reading those examples of male writers describing women. And Stephen King definitely has a proclivity towards bodily fluids of all kinds. But I agree. He has a lot of weird things about sex in general, I'll say. There's a very infamous scene in It that thankfully was cut out of the new movies, and a lot of other scenes and descriptions and, like you said, the thoughts that the female character would be having are just so wrong and just weird. And I'll say that pretty much all of his characters are sort of wrong and weird at times, so there's this part of me that's like, well, all of his characters are kind of over the top, and I don't actually find myself relating fully to any of them because the things that they go through are so extreme. But I draw the line when it comes to describing other things as rape, especially mouth to mouth. It was just like, dude, this is not a thing. Why would you say this?
It's literally the
I got
opening.
to that point in the book, which is, I think, in the first 5 pages at most.
It's right at the beginning, yeah.
Yeah, I went straight to the dock where we keep our notes, and I saw
Job
that both of you
done.
had already commented on it, and I was like, okay, it's been taken care of. I can rant about something else.
Yeah, I came across it and I like folded down that page. I was like, okay, I have to comment on this and I need to remember where this happened so I can refer back to it. And it is so early in the book that it's just like, ugh, why?
Since I can rant about something else, I would like to therefore rant about every single thought that Paul has about women in the book. Especially Misery. He really hates Misery herself, and he describes her in an absolutely disgusting manner. And from the pieces of the book that we see, it sounds like she spends that entire final novel unconscious. So I don't know that I, as a female reader, would like Misery or her depiction in this book series, given that she seems to be such a passive character to the point that she doesn't even speak in many of her scenes.
This is where my skipping over a lot of those scenes becomes really interesting because obviously doing the audiobook, I just kept kind of like scrolling ahead until I would suddenly hear Paul talking again. But every so often, it would be like just enough overlap where I would have to skip back like 15 seconds and suddenly it'd be like some fake African accent. And I was like, what is happening in this book? I don't really care, but also like, what is going on here? And I guess a lot of it was that.
It was a naked woman covered in bees and two guys fighting over her, and
Yeah,
the woman
the
can
bee
say
thing,
nothing.
there were moments where I kept coming over the bee thing and there was like a bee goddess or something that sounded like a statue and bees.
Yeah, yeah, that's
That's all
about
I
right.
know about the Misery novel. And there's like
Yeah.
a sailor or some sort of pirate.
Grisel, I think of the three of us, if Misery were a real series, I think you would be the fan.
I would not read Misery, and I have my explanations why in Catharsis Corner.
Yeah, it definitely is not a series that I would like. And I agree with you. The way he describes women pretty much throughout the whole book is bad. It's such a like weird relationship that Paul and Annie have, and knowing that it's sort of like based on this like very unhealthy real life drug addiction. It's like you could see these kinds of things where he obviously hates that aspect of himself and is like not wanting to be that person, and so it's like being projected on this character that's standing in for that, but it's a lot. Well, I'll say, just as a way to wrap up our ranting in a much lighter way, that in the book, Annie is constantly losing bobby pins, which Paul uses to pick the lock in his room. And this seems so unbelievable to me. I don't know how Stephen King thinks bobby pins work, but for me, they're not just flying out of my hair all of the time. So it was just like a weird moment where I was like, yeah, this wouldn't happen.
Yeah, I've never had a bobby pin slip out of my hair, and I know not Misery, Annie kind of like yanks her hair, but like those don't really slip out. They kind of just get caught and mired in your hair.
Yeah, I feel like I'm constantly finding bobby pins that are, like, still in my hair even though I thought I took them all out, so it just seemed like the opposite of how being a woman actually is and using bobby pins, so
I live in fear that I'll poke an eye out in my sleep because of a bobby
Oh
pin that I
my
missed.
god.
Oh, no. Uh, this is a terrible new fear that now I will take.
You're
Uh,
welcome.
Thanks. Well, I think we have a lot more to discuss and rant about, but let's do it in the catharsis corner. Well, we talked about it a little bit, and let's just get into it. I think that it's an interesting technique to have the segments of Misery's Return throughout the book, but I really did not enjoy reading those parts, especially the heavy handed dialect that is given to the African character who's their guide. I know that this is a trope of older Victorian era books, and that's clearly the inspiration for the Misery series, but I hate reading it in those books, and I hate reading it here. It's just so overdone, and it makes it actually hard to read what's happening, so everything about those segments was just not appealing to me.
So, my feelings about Paul as a writer and the reason why I said I would not read the Misery books is that Paul as a writer is a word that B won't let me use on the podcast. So, insert your favorite adjective there. He is a caricature of the worst kind of male writer. And as I said, I kind of like skipped over a lot of those misery scenes. It's not even, I think, that he's going for an older Victorian trope. I think he's going for the very worst tropes of old school romance. Given the time frame when this book was originally written and when the movie came out, like I'd say like he's going for the very earliest forms of like Harlequin romance style romance as seen by a very misogynistic male writer, which is not at all what romance is doing. So, Misery, as described in my interpretation, is not a romance. It is actually more along the lines of like an Outlander style historical with a romantic subplot, or even like a Poldark series, which is probably the closest I can think of as far as a story that has romance as an element, but is not actually a romance, and is written by a male writer. It's not a strict romance because the premise of a romance is that there's a happy ending. So you don't really see cheating or love triangles in actual romance novels. You see that a lot in novels that want to create a series where you have a will they, won't they plot line, which you don't really get in romance. Romance novels don't have ongoing series. They have series that jump from one character to another, but there's no continuation of. That's why it's not necessarily a romance per se. Plus, if you go with Paul's original decision to kill off Misery, it is definitely not a romance because every romance is guaranteed a happy ending. That's the whole point of romance as a genre, is that it puts the women in the center of the story. So it's about female agency and female pleasure and control over their own fates, whatever you want to interpret it as, depending on the story. But it's always about the woman and centering the woman. Whereas it sounds like Misery's a lot about the male characters, especially from what I got from B about her being like passed out for most of this Misery's return. So that's why I don't consider this a romance, and I don't like Paul as a writer. I would not want to read his books because I just imagine that they would be super misogynistic, super anti-women, and a lot of like overblown stereotypes about what men do and how men control women's lives. And that is my other soapbox.
And if misogyny is not enough, it's also extremely racist. The way that Paul describes his protagonist of Fast Cars, the novel he's writing that Annie makes him burn, there is no way that book is anything but extremely vile in its depiction of Hispanic characters.
I think given like my random 15-second clips of whatever is going on with the African character, we can safely say that there's a lot of racism in these books.
Yeah, exactly. I agree completely. The Fast Cars book sounds terrible, but I think we are supposed to believe that Paul is a bad writer and that Annie is bringing out the best in him. Although, again, the best, if Misery's Return is indeed his best, is still really, really terrible. So,
Kat, you joined the dark side. You just took Annie's side.
oh no.
Oh no, she's one of us!
One of us. One of us.
You've done it. But it's in this point, I do agree. I think that Paul is a bad writer, and I think that Fast Cars sounds really terrible. And in the book, he actually comes to realize, like, hey, maybe that book wasn't as good as I thought it was, and maybe it is good that I just got rid of it before anyone else read it. So that's why I wonder how much we are supposed to believe he's an actually talented writer. But either way, I appreciate all of your insight into romance and those types of historic adventure novels because I don't really have a lot of experience reading those types of books. And I think your descriptions of it help me understand more that it's definitely not meant to be a romance. So thanks for that.
I will add about Paul as well that when I say Paul is not a good writer, I don't even mean in terms of his talent. I feel like in terms of Paul's relationship to the writing as a profession and his audience, not in any way, I'm not saying murder the writer, but in the sense that he's doing this strictly for money. You get that right from the start. He's been doing this for money. He doesn't care about his fans. He doesn't care why these books are popular. He kind of got stuck with them and he kept writing because he felt like this was a cash cow. And then he wanted to kill off this cash cow because he wanted to be a serious writer. And even as he is driving, he's like thinking about like, and in his delirium too, it's like, oh, Fast Cars would be the book that would land him awards and stuff like that. So he's never doing it because he likes to write or he enjoys the, experience of being read. He just wants to have the title of writer with a capital W. And that's why I think he's a bad writer.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And obviously there's a lot of parallels to Stephen King, and he frequently writes about, or he frequently has books with writers as a main character. So it's clearly something that he's always sort of dealing with or thinking about and exploring. I will say that this book came out after Stephen King had wrote or had released a book that was more of a fantasy sci-fi, and he got a lot of feedback that was very negative and people didn't like it, and they told him basically you should just stick with horror. So I guess this was sort of his like pushback on that, and like how he felt about fans telling him those kinds of things. And he was also part of the reason he was like using his pseudonym Richard Bachman was to see if people at this point were just reading books because it was a Stephen King book, or if he was like writing under a different name, would it still be popular or would people still like it? So I think at this time he's having like all of these doubts about his career probably. And
How did Bachman sell compared to King?
oh, they sold
He
really
sold
well.
just as
They were
well.
very popular. Yeah, they were super popular. People loved them. And he had meant he was like going to keep doing it for a really long time, but like I said, that bookseller discovered his secret.
Actually, the funny thing is that I think Stephen King is not that kind of writer. I mean, I follow him on Twitter, even though I don't really read his books. I follow him as a person, and in his writing about writing, because he's not only written on writing the book, but he talks about writing fairly regularly. He's blogged about it. He worked for, I don't know if he still works for them, Newsweek, I think it was, or Entertainment Weekly. It was some
Entertainment Weekly.
Entertainment Weekly. So he is really engaged with popular culture. He appreciates writers that other writers like look down upon as like not serious writers. So I think he is definitely not that kind of pretentious writer who is only thinking about himself in light of like certain achievements and stuff like that. So I can see this also being like a way to grapple with that and to grapple with his own self doubt. He came into publishing at a time where it was not as saturated, so his stardom would definitely not be the same nowadays. So I can see him also having his doubts of like, are they just reading me because there's not much else to read and I'm popular, so they buy the book, or is there more to this? Is it me that they like? So I can definitely see a bad book having that kind of a response and him trying to think it through in his own writing.
Yes. Part of what makes all of this enjoyable is knowing that Stephen King is not that type of person or writer. And like you said, he's always been a person to promote popular culture and promote the enjoyment of pop culture and not put it down. And in a lot of his books, he always has like music references and movie references to things that other people would maybe think are sort of like cheesy or not as serious. But he's just a fan of those things, and he's so enthusiastic in his fandoms that I am able to like enjoy when he writes about these kinds of characters, because I know that that's not really him, and he's seems to be a much more pleasant person than his characters. So that's, yeah. Well, I think we're wrapping up our catharsis corner. Anything else we want to add?
Yes. How many times do I have to watch Matthew Cuthbert die?
I kind of
Oh my
hoped that the
god.
movie would let him live. I kept thinking it was going to happen.
And then I wanted an entire extended subplot about how Virginia finds out, how she reacts, how is this going to work, how long had they been married. I was very concerned.
I think
I
she
would like to
becomes the
imagine,
sheriff.
yeah, I was gonna say, I would like to
Good.
imagine that she becomes a Jessica Fletcher type of character where she just becomes the person solving all of the crimes. So I hope that is what happens. I know you were texting us at some point
Yes.
and you were like,
Suspicious silence.
yes. I was so nervous. I was like, oh no, I know what's gonna happen and it's not good.
Yes, for context, Grisel was the one who pointed out the sheriff was Matthew before I had seen the movie. So I said, well, I hope nothing happens to him. I don't want to see Matthew die again. And Kat and Grisel ignored me from
No
that point on.
response.
There was nothing to be said. He is a welcome addition to the movie, but just know you will have to suffer through that again.
And it happened very suddenly. I didn't have time to prepare.
It's such an interesting sort of thing where he's this character that you're rooting for and that you're following, and you're like, oh man, he's gonna get there. He's a good detective, he's figuring things out, and then he's just disposed of so quickly that it really is very shocking. A similar thing actually happens in the movie version of The Shining, which famously Stephen King does not like, but a character ends up with a similar fate, and I won't give too much away since we are not going to spoil that, but I guess that's just the thing in movies that they want to like shock people and perhaps add in like a different twist to get people who have read the book to still be surprised and scared. But it is pretty upsetting when it happens in this movie.
At least it didn't get run over by a lawnmower. I was reading that part of the
Yeah,
book with my hands over
yeah.
my eyes like it would help.
I have to agree. I think, being the 90s, they probably physically couldn't do that kind of an effect with it looking convincing, but also just that would have been worse and would have taken the tone of the movie in a whole other direction.
Yeah, and I'll say that that isn't the only character that dies by lawnmower in Stephen King's world. So it's something that he goes back to a lot. Well, since we were talking about The Shining, did either of you catch the small reference to it in this book?
I did, and I was
I
surprised that I
did.
did. Thank you, Simpsons.
Yay! He often sets his books in the same town in Maine, but even when it's not in that town, he always has these sort of like little tiny tidbits where he mentions another story or another character has heard of another character from a different book. And it's always just kind of a satisfying thing as a reader that you're just like, yes, I do know that from that other book.
Sharon Creech does that too.
Yes, and I love that when she does it. Yes, it's always very fun and satisfying, and then it makes you wanna read more by that author, like, "Ooh, are there other little references to these?"
What I thought was also fun was that in the design of the book that I read, it had a hilarious old school Harlequin style cover of the fictional Misery series beneath the cover of the real Misery book. And also, the pages that Paul writes were in a different typewritten font with the ends in a handwriting font, which was very cute and very clever. And then at the point of the story where he switches to writing in longhand, the font switched to a rather illegible handwriting font. So I thought it was very creative and I really enjoyed that aspect of the book design itself.
I did look up that cover at one point because I remember you mentioning it, and apparently that was a special edition that they ran. I don't remember which year, but it's worth a lot of money if you have that special edition.
Oh, and this is how I found out I'm a millionaire.
Wow. Well, I think we've catharted and discussed and ranted enough, so let's go to our sock ratings. We'll be giving a rating to the book and the movie separately, so B, why don't you give us your ratings?
All right. For the book, I will give it 3 socks. I'm trying to think of what's the best word to say. It wasn't nice. It was definitely not a nice book to read, but it was a perfectly cromulent book to read, hence my rating of 3. And the movie, like I said earlier, I did enjoy the movie more than the book, so I'll go ahead and give it 4 socks. And it also gave me something new for my aesthetic, and that's the sound of a typewriter over the music of Liberace. I enjoyed that very much.
That's really funny. I did love that addition in the movie that she's a big fan of Liberace and has framed photos of him in her living room. All right, Chriselle, give me your ratings.
Okay, so for the book, with some explanation that I will give afterwards, I will give it a 2. The reason being that, as I said, I didn't really care for it too much, and I actually sped up the audiobook to 1.5, which is a thing I have never done in my life because I was just kind of bored and I kept skipping over all of those misery scenes and Paul's constant talk about the pilings. I was like, I am done with the pilings. We're moving on. So I'll give it a 2. It got good after his foot got cut off. So that's from there on is where I enjoyed the book. And for the movie, I'll give it a 3 because I actually did find myself enjoying it. I don't know that I would watch it again unless, it happened to be on TV or I happened to, be hanging out with someone who wanted to watch it. But I found myself pleasantly surprised.
Okay, I'll take it. I myself am actually going to agree with B and give the book a 3. It's not my favorite Stephen King novel. Like I said, this was maybe my third time reading it, whereas other books of his I have read countless times. And it is so internal, and part of what I like about Stephen King is his sort of world building and all of the characters, and like I said, a lot of them happen in the same town. And this has none of that, so it's a solid 3 for me. I do like all of the discussion and thoughts about writing that Paul has, and, clearly we're getting a little insight into Stephen King, so I appreciate all of that. But I don't know that I would actually reread it, so it's a solid 3. The movie, on the other hand, I'm gonna give a 4 as well. I think it's really great. No, you know what? I'm gonna give it a 5. I just talked myself into it. I rewatch it
Wow.
frequently. I think it's one of his best adaptations. I think the casting is so perfect. The directing is really good. It's just all around enjoyable. I think if you watch the movie, you get a sense of sort of the appeal of Stephen King without sort of all of the excess things that we've discussed in the podcast. And I don't know, it just works as like a really good suspense story. And I think I like it because it's more suspenseful than horror. And I've come to realize that about myself, that I like the suspense, not so much the gruesome aspects. And so the book or the movie cuts out a lot of the gruesome things. So I appreciate that.
Me too. I only had to hide under my blanket twice.
Yeah. During which parts?
The foot amputation scene, which I did not want to watch,
Yeah.
and at the end, the battle between Annie and Paul, which was extremely well done.
Yes. I also, same for me. All right. Well, let's give our reading recs and viewing recs of similar things. I will start off by giving some recommendations for other Stephen King titles. Like I said, he has a lot of characters that are authors or writers. So I'll recommend The Shining and The Dark Half, both of which feature writers. Obviously, The Shining is very popular, has a very popular movie. The Dark Half, I don't think is as well known. And that one actually deals a lot more with his idea of like this pseudonym character, because in The Dark Half, the writer in the book has a pseudonym that gets killed off, but then suddenly, magically, mysteriously has come to life. So it's sort of like dealing with those different aspects of his personality. It's a little Jekyll and Hyde, but it's very well done. There's a pretty good movie adaptation of that one as well. For just something with similar-ish vibes, I'll recommend Dolores Claiborne. Like Misery, this is a Stephen King book that does not rely on the supernatural for its horror, and instead it's just a pretty straightforward, sad tale of a woman who works as a caretaker for a wealthy elderly woman who dies under mysterious circumstances. The book is written as Dolores's transcript to the police, and so you learn about the weird power dynamic that was happening between the two of them. And then you also get revelations about another mysterious death that is tied to Dolores, which is basically her abusive husband. And bonus, Kathy Bates actually plays the title character in the movie adaptation, which came out, I think, in 1994, so a few years after this.
That's cool.
Yeah, and she has actually said that she prefers that movie to Misery and that she likes that character a lot more, which is understandable. And another recommendation is Carrie. And this is his first book, and it has sort of that precedence for a female lead character who just doesn't really fit into normal society, which is probably a big reason why I was drawn to him as a nerdy middle schooler. And if we were to rank scariest female villains, then I think that Carrie's mother is right up there with Annie Wilkes. And I have two other book recommendations from other authors. The first is John Fowles's The Collector, which is actually mentioned in Misery. This is a really creepy, scary book about a young man who comes into a lot of money and decides to use that money to kidnap a woman and keep her hostage. So it's pretty disturbing.
And often found among serial killers' possessions.
Yeah, I could see why. It's almost, you could see it as a how-to guide because it's pretty detailed and, like I said, very disturbing. But, also a good book.
A great book.
Yeah. And then the last book is actually a book that I just read because I was looking up books similar to Misery, and I came across this book, which is a Korean book called The Hole by Hae Young Fun, and it was just translated into English a few years ago. It's the story of a man who is in a car accident, only in this car accident, his wife dies, and the only person left to take care of him is his mother-in-law, who, as you might imagine, has some resentment about the fact that her daughter died and he did not. And as she's taking care of him, she starts to mysteriously dig holes in the garden, and it's very ominous. I really liked it a lot. It was very different than Misery. It's more about the relationship between the character and his wife, and you sort of like get these revelations throughout as he's remembering things. But there is that aspect of a caretaker who is not doing her best, I will say. So for my viewing recommendations, I'll give a few movies that were part of a trend in the 1960s of psychological horror movies starring aging Hollywood female actresses. And there are two that actually have a connection to Misery. The first is Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which is actually mentioned in the book and is sort of the prototype of this genre of movies. It stars Joan Crawford, who is a wheelchair-bound, aging actress who is held captive by her jealous sister, played by Bette Davis. I have to imagine that King had this movie in mind as he was writing the previously mentioned Dolores Claiborne, because there's a lot of weird power dynamics between the two women. If you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it. It's probably one of these movies that's like referenced a lot and quoted a lot and has a lot of famous imagery. And it definitely, I would say, lives up to the hype. The second is a lesser known from this genre, and it's called Lady in a Cage, where a young James Caan is actually on the other side of the torture as he terrorizes an injured woman, played by Olivia de Havilland, RIP, who is trapped in a cage-like elevator in her home. That one is much more gruesome, I would say, and violent, and actually when it came out, critics really didn't like it. I have only seen bits and pieces of it because it is kind of too much at parts, but they are both pretty campy and filled with a lot of melodrama, and I love all of those actresses that star in them, so I would say check those out. Griselle, what about you?
I second Kat's recommendation for Carrie and also for Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. I don't know why I watched that movie, but it was randomly a movie that kept coming up on TV when I was like way too young to really watch it. So, yes, definite weird, creepy horror aspects in a closed house environment. Totally up the misery vibe. I do enjoy Carrie, so if I had to pick a Stephen King favorite, I would say that is mine. So that is my recommendation. And because I don't read a lot of horror, I am going to stretch this one and recommend In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, which is a memoir about psychological abuse and trauma. It is written in a very experimental style. It is not outright torture porn in the way that Misery is. It plays with genre very well. It is, however, harrowing in its approach, so if you need a trigger warning because you can't handle that, just skip it for now. But it's a great book, and she does mention Lady in a Cage. She writes an essay on it in that particular book. It's looking at her experience from different perspectives with genre as like the foundation for each section of the book. So it's a great book, but if you can't handle that kind of reading right now, definitely skip it. For an approximation of the Misery series, as I said before, I do recommend Outlander and the Poldark books. There's lots of sex in Outlander, if that's the Misery aspect that you're more interested in. And the quality does get worse with the longer the series goes on, so there's lots of melodrama to be had. Neither is a true romance, but it kind of has that Misery feel, in my opinion.
Nice. I think those are both great recommendations. B, what about you?
I will second your collector recommendation. I will also add two Stephen King books to the recommendations. The first one is Under the Dome because it's been established that I love aliens, but I emphatically do not recommend the TV series adaptation. The second book of his that I recommend is one that Griselle mentioned earlier, and that's On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft, which I just read this summer. It's half autobiography, half writing advice, but on the whole, it's a fascinating read, and I recommend it to writers and non-writing Stephen King fans alike.
Those are actually two Stephen King books that I have not read. I have On Writing, but I just never read it, and I have never read Under the Dome, so I will have to check both of those out now.
Oh wow, look at that. You've made a contribution.
I have not read Under the Dome, but I do recommend On Writing for anybody who just kind of wants insight into Stephen King's history and his early career. So it's a good one.
For non-Stephen King reading recs, I'm going to divide mine into similarly horrifying works and then palate cleansers. For the first horrifying work, I'm surprised that I'm the first one to put it on the list, and it's The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, as well as the brilliant 1991 film adaptation, the only movie I will forgive for beating Beauty and the Beast for the Best Picture Oscar that year. I will also recommend Room by Emma Donoghue and that film adaptation. I read this book all in one night without stopping a few years ago, and I was so engrossed that I couldn't put it down. It's the story of a captive woman as told by her 5-year-old son, and I think it is extremely well done. Have either of you read it?
No, that is another one that I had a copy of for ages. I think because it was someone compared it to The Collector, so I was interested in it. And then I just never read it, and it got lost in the shuffle of unread books in my house.
I read something about it at some point and I wasn't interested, so I just kind of skipped that one.
I highly recommend it if you're into this sort of work. And for something completely different, nothing like this sort of work, these are two lighthearted ones. The first is the book LMNOP by Mark Dunn. It's about an island that worships a statue, and as letters fall from the statue, the islanders are forbidden from using those letters in how they speak and write. The author himself stops using those letters too at that point in the story, so the book is increasingly constrained by the number of letters available as the story progresses. It's one of the most clever premises I have encountered, in addition to simply being a good story, and I was reminded of it thanks to the loss of letters in Paul's typewriter as the story goes on. For a viewing rec, check out the 2017 movie We Love You, Sally Carmichael. It's a charming story about a grumpy writer who reminded me of Paul Sheldon in that he is frustrated at not succeeding with his quote-unquote serious novels, but even more frustrated that his romance books have found a massive audience. They're analogous to Twilight in this movie. This writer, unlike Paul, uses a pseudonym while writing romance, the titular Sally Carmichael, and he prizes his anonymity. But when the movie begins, his book series has been optioned for film on the condition that the lead actor meets Sally Carmichael. Shenanigans ensue, and there's one joke towards the end that made me laugh so much I almost slid off my couch when watching the movie the first time.
Well, that wraps up what may end up being a very incriminating episode, depending on what happens or doesn't happen to certain creators in the future. We will leave them nameless to protect ourselves. That concludes this episode of the Bluestocking Circle podcast. For the show notes, visit thebluestockingcircle.com. Find us on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, Pinterest, and pretty much everywhere at Blue Sock Circle. That's Blue SOX Circle. Email us at thebluestockingcircle@gmail.com and join the conversation. You may also find us on Apple Podcast, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube, so please rate, review, and subscribe to help us grow.
Cheers!
Welcome to the Bluestocking. Oh, God.
That's the blooper right there. Literally the first 2 seconds of this
Wow.
podcast.
Okay. Cheers.
Cheers. To misery. I was thinking of that when they were toasting in the movie. Our little cheers.
Oh, yeah. To misery.